Hi, folks. Over the past few months, I've been making videos that discuss the grammar of the poem, diagramming the poem, and using the poem to access the thrill of the chase as if the poem was a table of contents or a reference into the book. I explained why I feel that way, so I don't want to reiterate that stuff. But I wanted to kind of step back a little bit and pick up where we left off and kind of try to discuss it in layman terms and also maybe provide a little bit more insight as to why I came to this conclusion, and hopefully you'll be able to understand this a little bit better. So last night in my Facebook group, I posted the following grammar question. What is the main subject and verb of the following sentence? When the coach asked the question, the player had a good idea. Pause the video right now and just try to think of what is the main subject and the main verb in that sentence. And as soon as you unpause it, I'm going to give you the answer to that. And let's see if you guessed it correct or not. I only had one response and it was wrong. The person had said that the main subject is coach and the main verb is asked. Although coach is a noun and coach is subject and asked is a verb and asked is an action, that is not the main subject and the main verb of the sentence. The main subject is player and the main verb is had. So let me try to explain why that is the case. But to do so, I'm going to briefly need to go over some definitions in grammar. Okay, first off, we have a phrase is a small group of words that forms a meaningful unit within a clause. A phrase cannot stand on its own as a sentence and is not a clause because a clause must have both a subject and a verb. If it did, then it would be a clause. So it may have a subject, or it may have a verb, or it may just be helping describe the subject or the verb. A clause is a basic unit of grammar that contains both a subject and a verb, but it may or may not be a sentence. It does have to have both a subject and a verb, but it may have a conjunction or something else in it that it is used as it's helping the sentence. It's not the primary subject and verb. So now there's two different types of clauses. An independent clause is a clause that can stand on its own as a sentence. Every sentence has to have at least one of those, an independent clause. Johnny kicked the ball. That is an independent clause. But if I put, let's say, a conjunction in front of it, and I said, while Johnny was kicking the ball, that is not a complete sentence. It can't stand on its own. That would be a dependent clause, which is a clause that cannot stand on its own in a sentence. It's an incomplete thought and is meant to be used with one or more other clauses to form a complete thought. And a sentence is one or more clauses that, when used together, form a complete thought. It must contain at least one independent clause. So in other words, an independent clause may or may not be a complete sentence. There could be more than one independent clause in the sentence. There could be a dependent clause, an independent with an independent clause, and so on, to make up a sentence. So just because it's an independent clause doesn't mean that it's a complete sentence. That would be determined by the punctuation. Now, when you're looking at a sentence and you're trying to determine the main subject and the main verb, they will always be part of an independent clause. So remember that. Now let's go back and take another look at that sentence now that we have some definitions behind us. When the coach asked the question, the player had a good idea. Well, if you look at the first clause, it says, when the coach asked the question, comma. So that's obviously a clause, but does it stand on its own? No, it doesn't. If all it said was the coach asked the question, then it would be an independent clause. But because it has this subordinate conjunction, when, it kind of leaves you hanging. I mean, just listen to it, right? When the coach asked the question, and then there's a pause. I'm about to tell you what happened. I'm about to get into the main part of the sentence. Okay. So we have the player had a good idea. Now, the player had a good idea is an independent clause. It could stand on its own. It's a complete sentence in its own right. But here, we have a dependent clause tied by this conjunction and the comma. Since the subordinating conjunction is in the beginning, we need a comma at the end of that clause. But we don't need a coordinating conjunction, because the coordinating conjunction could either be here or it could have been after the word question. But in this case, it's here. Okay. So clause 1 is dependent. Clause 2 is an independent clause, complete thought. This is why you're not supposed to use coach and ask. Because when somebody asks you to find the main subject and the main verb, they're talking about from the independent clause. A good idea is the object of the verb. That's what he had, a good idea. Okay. Which player? The player. Okay, now we'll take a look at the poem here, because this all relates to the poem. Forrest uses this idea a lot in the poem. As we can see here in stanza 1, let's break it down. And our work that we previously did with the diagrams is helping us do this. As I have gone alone in there. Now there's no comma here, but still we have a conjunction in the very next line. So this conjunction is joining these two phrases. Now this is a clause because it has a subject. The subject is I, and it has a verb, have gone. But this is an incomplete thought because he has the word as in front of it, which is a subordinating conjunction. So this is a dependent clause. So we're not looking for that subject and noun. Now in here, this and is joining these two. With my treasures bold is also a dependent clause. It can't stand on its own. You can't just say, and with my treasures bold. And with my treasures bold, what? Now we get to the next line. I can keep my secret where? That is a dependent clause. We could cut this out and put that as a sentence. It stands on its own. I could keep my secret where? Or I could keep my secret there. I could keep my secret, in the tree. It doesn't matter. That is a complete thought. It's an independent clause. Now the next line, again, conjunction, and hint of riches new and old. That is a dependent clause. And in this case, it's dependent on the rest of the stuff above it. So if we're looking for the main subject and the main verb here in stanza 1, the main subject is going to be I. And the verb is can keep. Now can is an auxiliary verb or helper verb working with keep. So keep is what they would call the simple verb. Can keep is the verb phrase. So, but that answers that question for that. And remember, a clause must always have a subject and a verb. In addition to that, it's got to use the same form of plurality and singularity. They have to be in agreement. If the noun is plural, then the verb has to be plural. Otherwise, it doesn't work. The same thing with the verb. The verb has to match the noun. If the noun's singular, the verb has to be singular. So when you're trying to find a subject in a sentence, it's best to try to find the verb first. That's usually the easiest. You read the whole sentence and try to find out what is the action that's occurring here. Okay. Once we know the action, we can then go back and find out who is doing or performing that action. And that'll show you which subjects are then become objects of the action, if there are any. Basically, stanza 1 is there to tell us that he keeps his secret location and the hints of riches new and old within something. And that something is described by clause 1 and clause 2, which in my opinion is the thrill of the chase. He went alone in the thrill of the chase. I discussed this before. He is displaying his treasures bold and talking about his treasures bold in the thrill of the chase. And by treasures, we're talking about memory. We're talking about things that are not necessarily material riches. Because he already used the word riches down here. And unlike treasures, riches does mean, riches is something of value. But treasures is also something of value, but it's usually not a material value. It's a loved one. It's a person. So again, line 1 and 2 are telling you where to look and what to look for. Line 3 is telling us the reason to look, and line 4 is telling us what we're going to find when we locate these places. Let's take a look at the lead-in sentence. Again, this is the sentence that precedes the poem in The Thrill of the Chase, and it's very important. It's important because it ends in a colon, and a colon does not end a sentence. And it's also important because it's telling us something here. He's saying, so I wrote a poem containing 9 clues that if followed precisely, it's going to do 2 things. It'll lead to the end of my rainbow and the treasure. Well, you think of your life as a rainbow, right? So the memoir starts in the beginning of time, or it starts at a time period, and it ends at another time period. At the end of that time period can be, metaphorically speaking, the end of your rainbow. So the end of the rainbow could be at the end of the memoir. Again, it doesn't end with a period, it ends with a colon. Now, in grammar, a colon must always be preceded with an independent clause. And it is usually followed with a description or a definition of something. So here we have an independent clause. And the colon means that whatever follows it, which in our case is the poem, is going to be what he is talking about here. It's going to be the definition of it, or the description. So if you really read that closely, and you look at stanza 1, what's at the end of stanza 1? Riches new and old. Well, could that be, the pot of gold, the treasure? The first period of the poem is at the end of stanza 1. Is that where this ends? It could be, because he has said that the poem, the first clue is stanza 2. Now, I'm not just going to take stanza 1 and throw it away, and I'm not going to do something and say, well, it's just describing the chase. No, it's not. Let's just cut to the chase here, no pun intended. The poem and the book go together. He already described in the book the whole purpose of the poem. He's not going to waste valuable space or 1/6 of his poem to tell you what the poem does. What he's using the first stanza for is to provide you a hint to use the memoir. We don't have to do it, but if you use it with the memoir, I believe that the lead-in sentence is telling us to do that, and so is the first stanza, because it's leading us to the end of his rainbow and the treasure. So here's what I think now. When you begin reading the book at stanza 2, the pronoun it usually by definition means something that was previously discussed or is about to be discussed. Think of it as a variable. So the first time through, if we're using a book, it literally means the memoir. So for the first time around, when you read Begin at Where Warm Waters Halt, you're beginning the memoir Where Warm Waters Halt in the memoir. And you're going to take it to Canyon Down in the memoir. And it's going to lead you to those hints. You got to read each stanza where it's the Begin at Where Warm Waters Halt and take it to Canyon Down, Homa Brown, so on and so forth. You have to pay attention when you're reading that, because he's describing specific places to go to, which is completely different than just reading the book outright and ignoring the poem. Just sit there and start from page 1, or page 4 actually is the first page in the book. When you do that, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. The problem is that you're going to locate a bunch of hints that may not be real hints. They may be aberrations, but they may be there to throw off the person that's trying to circumvent the poem. They're trying to take a shortcut. Remember, folks, this is a treasure hunt. This is a puzzle. We have to solve the puzzle. The poem is straightforward because the poem is nothing but a bunch of clues. But as he says in the lead-in sentence, the clues alone aren't enough. You have to follow them precisely. So I really believe, again, we got 2 omegas. The first omega is at the end of his rainbow, and the second omega is going to be at the treasure. So the first time again through, we go through the memoir. We apply the poem, all stanzas of the poem, from that point, from stanza 2 onward, to the book. Now guess what happens when you do that and you reach the end of the rainbow? Now comes in the T.S. Eliot quote. We shall not cease from our exploration, and at the end of all of our exploring, we will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So now that we went through the memoir using the poem and we reached the end of his rainbow, it's time to use the poem again, and this time to the treasure. But now we have the hints to help us solve the clues in the poem. So now the poem becomes a map to the real world. We follow the poem at real world locations using all of our newly gained knowledge. So we start back again at stanza 2. This time, we're following the poem with a real map. Well, basically, that's all I wanted to say regarding the first stanza. I've made all the videos. You can go back and look at the one where I do the diagram of all of the stanzas. And you can go back and look at my comments about the poem being a table of contents or an index into the thrill of the chase, because I discuss it over and over. I really believe that that's how it works. But in order to get it to work, you're going to need to understand some things about grammar. Now, perhaps that's why he said to let a child help, because all of this stuff is from grammar school. This is not complicated, but we learned this way back, and we tend to forget things. And I really like discussing the main subject and the main verb because it brings up a good point. When you first start out in school, probably in first grade, they teach you with very simple sentences how to find the main subject and the main verb. And to do that, they usually give you sentences that the subject of the sentence itself makes it very easy. In other words, John ran down the road. It's very easy that John's the subject there because the whole sentence is discussing the subject. But when you get a complex sentence where you have one or more clauses joined with punctuation, now you need to understand how the punctuation works, how to use the clauses to detect where the main clause is in order to derive the main subject and the main verb. You can't just look at it and think, well, what is this stanza talking about in the poem? Because you're not going to get it unless you look at each individual piece. Now remember, he formatted this as a poem, but he did use punctuation in the poem. So because he formatted it as a poem, it's kind of misleading because you're going to read it as if at the end of every line, there's a natural pause, but don't confuse that with a real pause. Don't confuse that with a real comma. And don't read it as if there's a comma there. Have a good day, folks. If you like this video, please subscribe and also pass the link around to this video. It'll help some people out. If you like it, be sure to give it a like and have a great day.